The word is yours.
Thank you. Okay, Bill, in the spirit that we're not introducing people, this is Bill Aspray, who is a historian of science and technology from the University of Colorado, who will be speaking about the importance of scrutiny to digital humanism.
Which one? That's forward.
That's forward and this backward. And
Okay.
the red one is the...
Right, okay. Well, I'm very delighted to be here today. I'm honored to have the invitation. As I talk today, I'm not going to say very much about the internet or about social media or about apps or even about algorithms, but they were all very much on my mind as I was preparing this talk. And I'm going to move over to the side, otherwise I'm going to be blinded by the video projector. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about the concept of scrutiny. It's a concept, and there are some related concepts to scrutiny that are ways of thinking about digital humanism. So rather than talk directly about digital humanism, I'm going to talk about some concepts. When I was first approached about being part of this presentation, I think the idea was that I could talk about the relationship between technology and law and policy, because it's an area that I did work in my earlier life. For example, I edited this book, Chasing Moore's Law, which was a book that discussed how technology moved forward faster than the law could keep up with in a certain kind of way. But I haven't been doing that kind of work for a while now, and so I counter-propose that I talk instead about some of the work that I'm doing currently with Jim Cortada, who is mentioned on the right. Jim Cortada is a sort of interesting man. He got a PhD in history and decided that he could never support his family well enough as an academic. So he joined IBM in the sales side of the company and moved up through the ranks. And by the time that he was retired a couple of years ago, he had had sort of low-level executive positions within the company. On the side, on the weekends and in the evenings, he would write, and he puts most academics to shame. He has published 60 books in his career. Those 60 books are published by Oxford, Princeton, MIT, so they're not lightweight kinds of books in any way. And most recently, he published a book with Oxford entitled All the Facts, which is a history of information in the United States since 1870. Cortada's main interest is in looking at information as an asset for either business or government. And I am much more interested in everyday kinds of uses of information. And so we've been working together. We were both very concerned about how we could respond to Donald Trump in this kind of modern world. And so we started to do what we know how to do, which is to write books. And we have written 2 books. The first one will be out in October. It's called, it keeps changing its name. The marketing people changed the name. It was called Before Fake Facts. The idea was to take 2 case studies from 200 years of American history in which lies and misrepresentations were major part of American public life. The second book is a book From Urban Legends to Political Fact-Checking, which is about the period from approximately when the public internet begins up until the 2016 presidential election, looking at political fact-checking from a much broader perspective, a perspective that shows how it came about through some people who were looking at urban legends and how you debunk urban legends over a period of time by using scrutiny. And in fact, some of you know Snopes, which is one of the major political fact-checking groups. Snopes came about through the Usenet group alt.folklore.urban, which was a place that did fact-checking of urban legends. Okay. I want to apologize. I'm an Americanist. My historical examples today are all going to be American. Even when I quote from German text, I'm going to do it in translation in English rather than in German in my talk today. Okay. So here's the structure of the talk I'm going to give. I'm going to reflect a little bit about what scrutiny is and what it isn't for a few minutes. I'm going to talk about the fact that we would like to be able to scrutinize things against base truth, but unfortunately we've known for 125 years that knowledge is socially constructed. And I'll go back and look at it from the late 19th century up till the present in this account. We're going to talk about the concepts of will to truth and will to power, which come from Nietzsche in two different works of Nietzsche. I'm going to then give you a long case study that compares what happened in the United States to prepare people both to have a will to scrutinize, but also have a capability to scrutinize, which has direct comparisons with what goes on in a situation with digital humanism today. And finally, if I have a few minutes at the end, I'll tell you about a surprising result we found. When people talk about intellectual history, whether it's intellectual history of America or Europe, for example, people who are showmen like P.T. Barnum or who are magicians like Houdini are thought of as curiosities. They're not part of the story in a particular way. But we found that a whole series of magicians and showmen were among the most perceptive scrutinizers in the world. They were people who criticized pseudoscience of one type or another over a period of time. And so someone might rewrite intellectual history with Houdini appearing with Helmholtz, with P.T. Barnum appearing with Einstein. We shall see if that happens. But anyway, if I have time, I'll talk about those things at the end. Okay, so I'm going to skip that. Okay, so what is scrutiny? Scrutiny is the careful and detailed examination of something in order to get information about it. This is not a very surprising definition. It's just what scrutiny is that you'd think it was. Scrutiny is an important part of scientific method, but it's also important to philosophy. It's important to understanding religion. It's increasingly important in a modern society in which you are bombarded by advertising and you're trying to determine the kinds of ways that you think about claims that are made by people who provide products and services. It's also an important character for both political election and for political governance. And so I've used this one quote here from Edward Snowden. Snowden might not be the person you'd want to think about as transparency in government, but he's keenly involved in it. I won't take time to read that. So, what?
Who is that?
That's Snowden. Yes, that's Snowden. Yes. Okay. So one of the interesting things about scrutiny is that while it's sometimes about truth, it's not always about truth. So, for example, the picture in this case is of Ernest Hemingway, the author. And if you're writing a cultural artifact, you're writing a historical novel, or any kind of novel for that matter, you want authenticity in it, truth to oneself in a certain kind of way. And so, as Hemingway says, you need a crap detector of a various kind of way in order to be effective as a novelist. You have to be able to cut away from things that are not really about it, but and get at the heart of certain kinds of things. I've written a long analysis of rumors and legends that were associated with the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I've categorized them into about 17 different types and looked at the ways that these have come about. When a folklorist or a sociologist looks at urban legends, they don't care about the truth or falsity. They're scrutinizing it to understand the cultural meaning of what's going on in a complex and dangerous world. So in that case, scrutiny is not about truth, but it's instead about cultural meaning. Hobbyists get involved in scrutiny in other kinds of cases. So for example, the people who were actively involved in alt.folklore.urban were looking at things both because they had this strong belief in practical rationalism, but also because it was enjoyable. It was a way to counteract the use of the internet as a place for spreading rumors that might not be true. It was a place that you could use. You could have a distributed group of people who were looking at the merits of certain kinds of claims. And so it was an antidote to the other kind of typical use. There have been a group of television shows. Mythbusters is one of the examples in the United States. They're so-called truth and fiction TV shows. The typical format in 30 minutes is you get 3 8-minute scenarios that you're told a story, and you as the watcher of the show has to decide whether something is true or false that's been told to you. And it gets revealed at the end of the show because there's an entertainment value to doing these kinds of things. Now, if you want to scrutinize something, you have to have some sense of what is correct, what is true. But we know from intellectual history that for at least 125 years, there's been this sense that the way that humans know is based upon some kind of social claim, some sort of agreed viewpoints. I want to make a distinction that Nietzsche makes in 2 of his writings, Beyond Good and Evil and The Will to Power. The Will to Power was published 15 years later, actually a year after he died. And the idea here is the will to truth is an unexamined belief in the value of truth, certainty, and knowledge over untruth, uncertainty, and ignorance. So this is not a reasoned belief. It's a belief. It's something that allows you to be part of the group of scientists or the group of philosophers. You have a belief that this is the way that the world should work. There are another set of people corporate capitalists, politicians, Donald Trump in particular, for example, who instead believe in the will to power. You ignore or deny objective facts, and you appeal instead to emotional and personal belief because you have a set of goals, and this is your way to get at those rather than reasoning in some particular way. Clearly, one of the things that would have to happen in digital humanism is that you would get people to follow a will to truth rather than a will to belief. So I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about the social construction of knowledge. And I'm going to start with a case that some of you probably already know about, a case from the 1960s of Thomas Kuhn's. Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions is one of the few academic works that has sold more than 1 million copies. I was a wanderer when I was in graduate school, and I enrolled in 5 different graduate schools before I got my PhD. One of the graduate schools I was in was Princeton, and for 1 semester, Thomas Kuhn was my thesis advisor. But anyway, so remember what Thomas Kuhn says in his work. He says, for a period of time, science is going on. There's so-called normal science. There's a framework for understanding what's going on in this scientific discipline. People, by and large, buy into this framework for a period of time, but then anomalies creep up into the field. There are things that can't be explained by the framework that exists. And after a period of time when people can't resolve those anomalies, they get serious enough that there's a revolution, there's a change in paradigms. And typically that change doesn't get fully enacted until the next generation, to the students of these people. And then there's a new version, there's the next generation of normal science that's going on. But notice that this is not because the world had to be this way, it was because a group of scientists bought into a particular kind of framework about how science works. So, one of the earliest people to have a belief in the social construction of knowledge was Nietzsche. And I will read this particular long quotation to you. What then is truth? A movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred and embellished, and which, after long usage, seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have become drained of sensuous force, coins which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins. So for Nietzsche, truth isn't about how an assertion matches against some objective reality in the physical world, but it's instead about how well an assertion aligns with a set of metaphors that have been accepted at a particular period of time. This is the one slide history of social epistemology. So it begins not only with Nietzsche, but with Emil Durkheim in 1895 in his most famous work. There are continuous other people. The concept of social epistemology, the term for it, was created by Margaret Egan and Jesse Shera. I don't know who Margaret Egan was. Jesse Shera was the most important information scientist in America of the mid-20th century. In the 60s, there was not only Kuhn, who we talked about earlier, but Michel Foucault has a kind of concept here. There's a more radical agenda that's emerging in the 1980s when Bruno Latour and Steve Woolgar published Laboratory Life, The Social Construction of Science. And then in the 1980s, the journal Social Epistemology, and in the early 2000s, the journal Episteme are created, and they continue to be the two places where you find the scholarship about the social construction of knowledge. Okay, so what I'm going to do for most of the rest of my time is to give you one major case study. It's a case study about how in the United States people became interested, came to value the notion of scrutiny, and how they also became possible of doing it. And the argument that's made here is that there are 6 exogenous forces. Those 6 are listed here, but I'll talk briefly about each one of them independently, and that they all came together in the late 19th century. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, you started to see a real interest in scrutiny taking place in the United States. Okay, so the first of these was the rise of literacies. And literacy is an interesting notion because it means different things to different people. Is it that you can write your name? Does it mean that you're able to read? Does it mean you're able to write more than just your name in a way? It turns out that in the United States, up until even from colonial times, there was a fairly high level of literacy among whites, not among blacks, for example. But this increased considerably after the Civil War between 1860 and 65 because the public education system came into place, so that there was almost universal literacy in the United States by 1900. And even for blacks in the United States, the literacy rates were above 80%. Interestingly enough, literacy comes to children before it comes to adults. There are also other things that maybe are not called literacy all the time. Sometimes they're called, for example, numeracy, ability to use the 4 basic arithmetical functions. There are others also. It was considered a literacy in the late 19th century about whether you knew how to read a map or whether you knew how to do surveying. And over a period of time in the 20th century, new things were considered literacies in a way. Ability, for example, to be able to scrutinize things that you read online. Abilities to create apps rather than just to use apps, and so on. So it's a moving target in a particular kind of way. Anyway, by the end of the 19th century, we have fairly high rates of literacy in the American population. The next of these exogenous forces is data-driven governance. So as part of the Constitution, there was a mandate for a census every 10 years of the population of the United States. In 1804, when the United States made the Louisiana Purchase, which increased the size of the United States by 1/3 in a single piece of legislation, it was immediately followed by expeditions to map this out to gain data for the operations of the United States. The telegraph became a technology that was introduced into the US in the 1840s. It was used during the Civil War. After the Civil War, it was used to explore the West and to capture data about it. So routinely, weather data was captured and sent back to Washington in this period of time. Also, the movement of Indian tribes was regularly captured and sent on. And in future administrations, for example, in the New Deal administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, there was lots of data-driven analysis. So the government is both a collector of data and a user of data in making decisions. Another exogenous force is the establishment of natural and social sciences. I'm not going to take the time to tell you the whole history of science here, but remember, we have induction coming in the late 16th century, deduction coming in the 17th century. By the beginning of the 18th century, physics and astronomy were well established using scientific methods. In the first half of the 19th century, what you found was that other natural sciences, such as biology and geology, increasingly became moved by using a scientific method. The harder place to get the establishment of the scientific method was in the human sciences, the social sciences, and this took place over the course of the 19th century. And I'm well beyond my slide. So this was the example of some of the things that were going on during this period of time. A couple of other things happened to better institutionalize science and the scientific method as a method for uncovering truth during this period of time. One of them happened to be the Morell Acts. The Morell Acts of 1860s and 1890s established land-grant state universities that were universities that were focused on doing practical arts, on doing engineering, on doing agricultural science, and they wholly adopted scientific methods in doing the work. The other thing was the creation, about a decade after it happened in Germany, in the late 19th century, was the creation of scientific businesses and laboratories in the United States. So Bell Laboratories, Edison's laboratories, DuPont are all late 19th century activities who are driven by using science to discover new facts and create new products. Okay. Another one of these changes happens in the media industries. So in the United States, up until 1870, the newspapers were almost entirely the organs of political parties. And so they were just the spokesplace for a given political party. In 1870, the business model changed for newspapers in the United States. The idea was that we're going to start advertising, we're going to try to make money out of these rather than just having them be a political communication device. There's a battle that goes on between 1870 and 1990 between two different ways of approaching this. One of them is the approach of sensationalism, the so-called yellow journalism. The big example was that the newspapers in the United States stimulated the population of the US and the lawmakers to go to war with Spain over the situation in Cuba. And this is one of these sensational accounts that appeared in one of the New York newspapers from this period of time. And indeed, the US did go to war in the Spanish-American War of 1898. The other group of people, however, the other model for doing newspapers was to have it be fact-driven in a particular kind of way. And a new profession was created. The professional fact-checker comes in this period of the last 3 decades of the 19th century. The fact-checkers that worked for newspapers then do not do the same things that the fact checkers do today. Fact checkers today look at what a politician was saying and are trying to figure out to what degree they are misrepresenting things. The fact checkers then were trying to make sure that their papers, in both their news reporting and in their editorials, were based in hard facts. That was the goal here. And in fact, the journalists didn't like the fact checkers very much because they limited their ability to say what they wanted to say. Another of the exogenous forces that's going on during this period of time is progressivism. This notion that you can use truth to set you free, that you can solve social problems by uncovering what's going on. Transparency is a mantra in this particular case. And there are two iconic publications that embody what's going on in progressivism. The first is Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, which is about the meatpacking industry in Chicago, and it leads to the creation the following year of the Food and Drug Act and starting to put food safety in the United States. The other was Ida Tarbell's book about the history of Standard Oil and looking at the excesses of monopolies and all the ruthless things that were being done by the Rockefeller family in this period of time. And this led to the application of the Taft-Hartley Act to break up some of the conglomerates of this period of time. But you started to see a set of new regulations that were trying to get at what was going on in the situation. The other is about data and infrastructure. So the case of the 19th century is that it was taking longer and longer for the US government to process the data results from the decade census. It had taken them 7 years to do the processing of the 1880 census, and they estimated that the population had doubled over that period because there was such strong immigration. So they thought they were going to get behind. There was a competition run by the American government, and the creation of punch card tabulating equipment was the result of this. And so for the first time, there is now a new kind of information technology for storing and for recording and calculating in these cases. The punch card tabulating systems are used at first only for the government, but then they are used by the railroads to follow their rolling stock. And by the 1930s, there are large data sets. There are data sets that have more than 1 million punch cards in a particular collection during this period of time. After World War II, just sort of an aside, there was this strong interest by government agencies and social scientists to be able to use the data that was being generated by the government. And there was a proposal in the early 60s that these two groups thought would fly through, that they could create a single national data center. And that was quickly disabused when Vance Packard, the journalist writing for the New York Times, showed that there were privacy concerns. And so this was dead in the water by 1965. Yes, okay, 5 more minutes, all right? But of course, in the period in the 1960s and 70s, we start to get powerful computers, large data sets, database technologies, and so on that make for much more powerful collection and use of data. I wanted to take just a moment to mention something about what's going on today. So, for the most part, when people look at excesses of Donald Trump or others about political facts, the main discussion has been about either educating the public about being more aware, being better at doing this, or educating journalists about how to interact with potential subjects of stories, sources of their materials. But in the last 2 years, there's been an increasing use of technology, not just education, as part of the process of doing political fact-checking. A group of these are efforts to use crowdsourcing, for example, to either create or to evaluate the quality of journalism. One of them is by Jimmy Wales, the creator of Wikipedia, for example. It's actually gone bust after only about a year's time. There are a group of people who have been trying to use technologies such as ways that you can read online a set of news stories, and then you'd have a database connection to PolitiFact so that you could check the quality of things as you were reading on through it. There are apps that have been created. And one French journalist, whose name I can remember, Frédéric Filou, had been on a year at Stanford, and he started to use deep learning as a way of creating reliable sources. So there are a set of things that are done there. Okay, so I won't take much time to talk about this, but let me say, with regard to magicians and showmen, that there's this sense that they have repeatedly, over a period of time, come through and been important in debunking pseudoscience that went on. So P.T. Barnum debunked William Mumler, who was creating photographs that showed spirits of ancestors in the background. These were sort of like photoshopping in a kind of way of an early time. Mark Twain complained about phrenology. As you might know, Mark Twain had to quickly leave the United States because he had a lot of debts. And so he moved to London, and there were these two important phrenologists at the time. And he went to see them undercover twice, about 6 months apart, and he got radically different readings the 2 times that he went, and said, if their readings are not reproducible, then this is not science. That was sort of the basic argument. He also didn't like one of them because it said, you have no sense of humor. Houdini was able to show how the most popular American spiritualist at the time, Mina Crandon, was doing her seances after a committee that had a MIT professor and a Harvard professor was not able to do that, and so on. Carl Sagan, who is of course an astrophysicist from Cornell, but is also a showman doing shows, shows how a group of people, a husband and wife, Betty and Barney Hill, were not abducted by aliens, and so on. So anyway, I'm going to stop at this point, and we can. I will be answering questions, I guess.
Okay, let's start with thanking Bill for these remarks. So we now have 10 minutes for Q&A, discussion, and so on. I guess I'd like to use the fact that I have the microphone to kick it off, because I have a question that I sort of hoped you would address, but you were addressing a different aspect of current uses of technology. But one of the things that has recently caught computer scientists by surprise, I think, is the inscrutability of deep learning algorithms. inability to understand why they come up with the certain classifications that they come up with. And, you know, scrutiny is your topic, so this seems very relevant. And so my question is whether there's some connection between the need for explanation and this social construction of knowledge. Because if truth is sort of absolutely defined, then there's no law of nature that says the truth needs to be simple or explainable. But if truth is socially constructed, then it has to be conveyed somehow between people, which sort of requires it then to be simple and explainable.
Right.
So maybe there's a connection between these.
Well, the gold standard is transparency in these cases. And so the fact that you get surprising results from deep learning, that you can't explain what's going on, you can't explain why the outcome is this as opposed to something else, is seen as very problematic to a number of the critics. But it's been recognized since the 1940s that sometimes knowledge is so complex that humans are going to have a hard time. Wittgenstein, in his later work, for example, talks about this particular case. Some things are just harder than people can understand.
Okay. I'm going to pass around the microphone.
Thank you. I want to point out that there seems to be something like an uncertainty principle in social sciences. Yes. And by this I mean whenever you have some qualities of a population and you want to measure it quantitatively by just one measuring points, then the population acts to that and you measure something else completely soon after. The example that came to my mind to write this down was the impact factor in scientific publications. But of course you see it also in the quality of the answers of Google quests, which went down tremendously in the last 15 years. And I think this is just because there is so much advertisement and going on, which just dilutes all these weights of web pages pointing to each other, so that this huge matrix eigenvalue computations.
So,
yeah,
right.
okay.
I agree entirely with the things that you say. You know, social scientists have a much harder time than natural scientists do in certain kinds of situations because they're using metrics that they can create. They're metrics that are easy to, for them to observe and to capture in certain kinds of ways, but they often don't get at the heart of the kind of things that they're really wanting to know about, right? And this is sort of a fundamental problem of the social sciences. I don't know how one gets around it. The thing to say here, I suppose, is that you want to have a will to truth. And so you want to have a framework of understanding among the practitioners that, yes, we recognize there are limitations to the kinds of things we're doing. We not only don't want to game the system, but we also want to reflect on the limitations of the kinds of methods that we are able to use, the metrics that we're able to use in our work.
Okay, so my remark is connected to the remark from the first speaker, and is on the importance of language in communicating knowledge and discussing about knowledge and in building knowledge as a social construct. Because in language there are a lot of possible traps, while facts in itself speak by themselves, but as a reality I have a glass with some water in it, but I can report this pure fact as the glass is half empty or the glass is half full. And in choosing the language by which I report the fact, I have an interpretation. And this is an important thing. I think sometimes this is neglected, that unless we write mathematical formulas, that maybe are absolute truth, whenever we use natural language, there is implicitly somehow a decision that has been made.
I simply want to acknowledge your remark. I won't reply. Yeah.
This is just again a follow-up question to the first question you had. So if you have an algorithm that you cannot explain, why it came to a certain decision, so you cannot scrutinize, then there's an ethical problem here. If I'm using these results to guide my decision, I'm giving up my responsibility to the algorithm because, for example, I'm using a result of something that I don't exactly understand to decide about a person. And how can I do it if I cannot scrutinize?
Right.
So giving up and accepting the result, it is not a good explanation. I need to be able to explain why if I have to make a responsible decision about it, right?
Indeed. I would step back even one step further, though, and say maybe our ability to understand an algorithm, for example, is a limitation of humans. But it's even more of a limitation if you don't believe in scrutiny, for example. If you believe, if you have just pure belief in technology, or if you have a belief in your government or in a corporation, and you just are willing to accept those particular things that have all kinds of values embedded in that algorithm in a way. So the will to scrutiny in this particular case is an important feature. As you say, it's not enough. It's a limited ability in some cases to do this, but it's something that Donald Trump, for example, doesn't want you to do. He doesn't want you to scrutinize his claims. He wants you to believe his claims, right? And so scrutiny is important, but it's not enough. Right.
Okay. It's perhaps more of a comment than a question. I wanted to remind us of Robert Merton, the sociologist of science, and his ethos of science. And one of the ethos points was the scientific community is bound together by organized skepticism. This is why we have peer review. This is why we continuously scrutinize the claims that scientists make. Is it up to the state of the art of the field, etc.? And this is something that has led not to some kind of absolute truth, but I would speak about an approximation to truth. Mm-hmm. This is the consensus where you can get with organized skepticism. Now, probably we can say today, the scientific community, we have failed with this Enlightenment vision to convey this to the public, to society, and to get it really entrenched there. And I think one of the reasons was that we are not good in explaining what is a fact. Fact, the Latin root of it is factum. It has been made. Facts don't fall from heaven. They have been made. And in science, and you scrutinize the process through which you arrive to say something is a fact, knowing very well all facts are temporary, because there will be new knowledge that will be generated, and facts will be replaced by new facts, which are better in various dimensions. And this is something that we, in this discussion, I feel very often we do ourselves a disfavor in saying these are the facts, instead of trying to educate and to explain how facts are arrived at. This brings me to the second comment. When you were speaking about the data, and the way how data acquire a kind of factness status. I think what we forget, and this goes back to language, data needs categories. They need classifications to arrive at the form of being a data. Otherwise, you have data points that are noise. And we put far too less emphasis and scrutiny, I would say, in what are the classifications. If you go back the history of statistics, it's full of changes that had an enormous social economic impact because you changed the categories in which you were collecting your data. And so my plea is, if you go on scrutinizing, you don't forget to look what are the underlying categories of the data that you want to scrutinize.
Right. So I'll make two remarks, and one of my remarks comes back to your comment here. So yes, you have a fact that you have a half-full glass of water, but over a period of time, the explanations about solids versus gases, for example, have changed over time. So the understanding of what the underlying science is there is something that has changed over a period of time. With regard to your first remark, at first I was appalled by what was going on in politics in the United States. But I've been actually quite positive about things, optimistic about things in the past, despite all of the hammering that the journalistic community has received from politicians. They are resilient, and they continue to argue about these kinds of issues. And I think that while you can be dismayed by the general education of a community, there's still a strong group of people who have strong backgrounds in science and engineering and even in good social science. I know that's a value judgment. And that persists over a period of time, even though there are large numbers of people who are not very critical, for example, in their consumption of media.
Okay, I'd like to say the last question now for this round. We're going to have a lot of chance for discussion over the next 2 days. I want to make sure that we get coffee before we all suffer too much caffeine withdrawal. So last question, and then Marco, you'll be up.
I would like to come back to language, and specifically to language technology, with a reference not so much to facts, but to influencing, persuading, which per se is a challenge. And as philosophers of language have taught us that whenever we speak to change the state of the word by acting on someone else's head. Persuasion is more, has an emphasis on this change. And language technology has a big challenge and could really help in that. You could have a machine that points out, wait a moment, with this message, it is trying to influence you in one direction, even without knowing very well the facts, which is a very hard challenge for us. For instance, there are some initial works on detecting urban legends as such. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is a big challenge for AI and for natural language technology in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. The goals of technology development are not necessarily ones that are consonant with your suggestion here. You know, they're ones about coming with certainty, or at least authority in the kinds of answers, rather than making more transparent what's underlying an algorithm, for example, or where a decision has to be made at a particular point, or the ambiguities that occur at a particular case. All of those things could be done if there was will to do those things, right? Though they're not easy problems. They're things that people could make some progress in doing. But that hasn't necessarily been the intention of the designers of certain kinds of deep learning processes that go on in these cases.
Okay, let's thank Bill Aspray for coming all the way from Colorado for us. Thank you.